Hi, I'm Diane Drew, and I'm here with Peggy Jackson, and we are two of three co-presidents for the Larchmont-Mamaroneck League of Women Voters. We're here to introduce and support the forum. The League of Women Voters is an organization that is almost 100 years old. We have broad memberships. We have men, women, and young people over the age 18. It's an organization that is nonpartisan, political, and we encourage people to participate in government, hence this forum. That's why we're supporting it. We want people to know the issues and the candidates. I want you to be aware of a couple of resources for the League of Women Voters. We have a website, and if you Google League of Women Voters, Larchmont-Mamaroneck, that will take you directly to our site, and we will have a summary of the issues and profiles of the candidates. We also have another resource, a website called vote411.org. That also will show you a handbook, a voter handbook, and give you locations of where you can vote. It will have a summary also of the issues and profiles of the candidates, because we know the more you're informed, the more you will participate, and we will strengthen our government. And we also encourage you to become members of the League of Women Voters. Peggy?
Hi. I'd like to introduce our candidates, explain what it is we're doing here tonight. There is a Democratic primary in the village of Mamaroneck. There are 4 candidates running. They are Andreas Bermudez-Hallstrom, David Finch, Alyssa Miller, and Leon Potok. Andres, Alyssa, and Leon are all incumbents, and David is running for the first time. Alice Bloom is our host for this forum. She's our moderator. She is a former League of Women Voters member, and she also does a show here on LMC-TV called A Town and Village too, which we encourage you to watch. The primary is on Tuesday, September the 9th. Polls open at 6 o'clock in the morning and go until 9 in the evening. We encourage you to vote. Also, the League will be holding our annual candidates debate. That will be on Tuesday, I believe, October the 8th. It is October the 8th, I'm not sure of the date. 2014 in the town center. The debates will be handled for all of our local elections in the village, in the town. Also, state assembly and state senator will be debated, and our local judgeship as well. So we encourage you to tune in for that or come down for that. It begins at 7:30 on October the 8th. And don't forget to vote in the general election. Again, if you'd like to help us out at the League, we would love to have you come and join us in any shape, size of time that you can give us. We do need some help, so please go on our website. Ladies and gentlemen are welcome. That's www.lwvlm.org, League of Women Voters, Larchmont-Mamaroneck.org. So please join us and enjoy the forum.
Thank you.
Welcome. I'm Alice Bloom, and a hearty thank you to Peggy, Diane, and Alice, the co-presidents of the League of Women Voters, and to the League for sponsoring this forum. We are anticipating the Democratic primary on September 9th. Let me introduce the candidates who are with us tonight. Leon Potok, incumbent. Alyssa Miller, also incumbent, both running with endorsement of the Democratic Party. Andres Bermudez-Hallstrom, also incumbent, running without endorsement this time. Dave Finch, you're making your first bid for trustee.
Yes.
And running with endorsement. Thank you so much for being here. This is a conversation, not a debate, and I hope to try to get you all to participate as heartily as possible. I've asked you all to reflect for a moment and tell us very briefly a little bit about yourself, any salient facts that you think voters should know, and why you would be effective as a continuing trustee or as a new trustee. We'll start with Leon first.
Okay. Well, my wife and I and 2 oldest kids moved up to Mamaroneck 23 years ago. Initially, we moved up to the town. We moved to Larchmont, spent 7 years there. And then the last 16 years, we've lived in the village in Heathcote Hill. We have 3 children at this point. The oldest is 27, the youngest is 20. Prior to moving up to the Westchester, we lived in New York City. I lived in Detroit, in Massachusetts, in the Bronx, and in Israel.
You moved around.
I moved around, and so, but this is my home. My wife and I have been married this year will be 30 years. My initial involvement in the village in community affairs really started about 7 years ago, initially with the Budget Committee, where I served for 5 years as chairman and the last 2 years as trustee. And until that point, like many other residents, I didn't pay a whole lot of attention to local affairs. It became important. I realized the importance of local government essentially when I was watching the debacle of Westchester Day School, and I decided I would make an effort to get involved, to get engaged, and try to bring my experience to bear. My professional background is I'm in finance, spent several years investing money for an insurance company, but primarily have spent 30 years plus as a financial advisor to labor unions, assisting in negotiations of collective bargaining agreements, and typically problem situation, crisis situations where my advice is sought after and used.
And as a continuing trustee, what do you think you could accomplish quickly?
There's a lot to accomplish. We have big issues ahead of us. We have, as we'll talk about during the program, we have an industrial area committee that will review and make recommendations to the board about how to better utilize the industrial area in terms of economic development. We have the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers coming up with flood mitigation strategies that we will need to get financed, partly by the village, partly, but mostly outside the village. And we have village assets that are falling apart that we need to figure out what to do with them.
So much that we're going to talk about through the substance of the conversation. Thank you, Leon. That's great. Alyssa, how about you?
Hi. Well, thank you so much for having us. It's an honor to be up here with my fellow candidates and folks. But so who am I? I've been here in the village of Mamaroneck for 11 years. I have a almost 11-year-old son who goes to Rhineck School District. He'll be in 6th grade in the Rhineck Middle School. I have been very active in the community since I got involved and since I moved here. I was recruited initially to be part of our homeowners association, where I was a vice president for a year. Then I was president for 6 years. And when one of my neighbors was a trustee here in the village, I was then asked to join one of the committees in the village, the Mamaroneck Avenue Task Force. So I got involved with the village pretty much from the get-go. I've always been pretty active, so it wasn't a surprise to me or my husband or my family. We've all been pretty active growing up. I have been coming up to this region my entire life. My grandmother lived in New Rochelle. And so Mamaroneck, every other weekend we would come up and go to Tung Hoi. Do you remember Tung Hoi?
I do.
It was a great family restaurant, and we miss it dearly, and I'm honored to be here. And I'm very much looking forward to the opportunity to continue to serve this community in any which way I possibly can. When I was prior to serving as a trustee here in the village, I ran the Rhineck Spring Fair. I co-chaired that with Carol DeLitta. We had a great time doing that. I've been active in the PTSA, and I know that they're hunkering to have me back, but if you don't let them, I'm okay with that.
Okay, you're willing to continue on as
Absolutely.
trustee. Thank you,
Absolutely.
Alyssa. That's great. Andres?
I'm 29 years old. I've been living in Westchester for the last 26 or so years. I live in a apartment in Washingtonville on the Avenue. I live with my fiance. Professionally, I'm a lawyer involved in litigation. I also dabble in voter protection, and I had a legal advice booth in Zuccotti Park during Occupy Wall Street. I've been involved in public service my entire adult life. I was an emergency medical technician in college. I was an emergency radio operator in law school, and I'm currently serving as an officer in the Civil Air Patrol. I helped out Mamaroneck in 2007 during the nor'easter. I was a radio operator in the shelter at the high school, and I was deployed through Civil Air Patrol to the shelter in Mamaroneck High School in 2011 and 2012. I initially got involved in the village because of the flooding. I was appointed to the Flood Mitigation Advisory Committee in 2012. And I ran for village trustee because I wanted to help my community to continue my public service.
Very good. Thank you very much. Dave, how about you?
Well, I'm the new face at the table, so hopefully I won't take too much time giving more background than maybe the others that are
We
better
want to know
known.
about you.
Yeah. After living short times and longer times in about 5 different countries other than the States, I've had a residence here in the village for 40 years. I've lived up on Beach Avenue for the last 25. My wife Leslie of 12 years, of course, is there with me. Both of my kids reside in the village. My daughter Jen and her husband Michael Valentine both graduated from Rhinebeck High School. Their daughter, Mali, is 5 years old, and she starts in Daniel Warren in 1 more month. She's a granddaughter, therefore she's wonderful and she's a joy. On the professional side, of course, I started out with a BA from Hamilton in government, and then went on to get an MBA from NYU in banking and finance. I joined various banks. Some people will remember names like Manufacturers Hanover, American Express, International Bank, Bank of New York Consumer Loans, even Washington Mutual Home Loans. In the meantime, I spent about 40 years as a volunteer, officer, or board member of organizations at the international, national, and county level, such as Chambers of Commerce, Boy Scouts, the UN Association, United Nations Association, and of course I began to volunteer more recently with At Home in the Sound and LMC-TV, where I'm a lot more familiar with being behind the camera throughout Larchmont
Dave,
and
let me ask
Mamaroneck.
you, as trustee, what would you like to see accomplished? Briefly, because we're going to get into the substance of it very
okay.
quickly.
I've been playing catch-up ball with the 3 that have been deeply involved in the issues. And what I want to see is this village continue to be managed by progressive values, the kind of values that we as Democrats are recognized as holding dear. And I think that it's really important that the Democrats maintain a strong majority on the Board of Trustees. And I've been valuing what I've been joining Leon and Alyssa on, and trying to understand the issues and to apply my ability to analyze, study, and work with others toward finding solutions, not only of problems, but of opportunities.
Very good. Well, let's get into some of those problems and let's see how we feel about them. I'm going to try to be as fair as I can. We're going to start with the first question to Leon, and then we're going to progress. So everybody gets a chance to be first, everybody gets a chance to be last. Okay, kids? All right. Here's the first question. Have you any conflicts of interest between your personal or professional life and your current or future position as a trustee in the village of Mamaroneck? The answer could be no. You don't have to elaborate if you don't have to.
That's an easy one. No.
Okay, thank you for your brevity. Alyssa?
Well, my day life, I own and operate a global PR firm that serves the telecommunications industry. I think that's an asset. So for me, it's an absolute no-brainer that there is no conflict of interest. Though I own and operate my business out of my home here in Mamaroneck, I have employees all over the country. So I don't have any particular, conflict on a local level. And I've enjoyed doing what I've done and continue to grow my business, even with the challenges that we have here in the village and all the time that we put in as trustees.
Very good, thank you. Andres?
I don't have any conflicts. When I got elected, I gave up all of my cases on my clients that had matters pending in the village court. There was only one at that point. I haven't been involved in any lawsuits against the village. I've never sued the village. As far as I know, none of my clients have ever sued the village. And I don't have any property interests or business interests in the village.
Okay, great, thank you. Dave?
The short answer is no. The slightly longer answer is that having been retired for a short period of time, I find that it's exactly the opposite. My interests are more and more involved in what's going on in the village, more than they were when I was traveling internationally and spending most of my day between trains back and forth to Grand Central Station.
Okay. Okay, so no conflicts here, so we have lots to talk about. Okay, Alyssa, you are my first victim. Do you think that the Board of Trustees should consider changing zoning regulations to permit construction of multifamily condos on the Hampshire Golf Club property?
Oh, you
This
gave
is
me a
hot
good
topic.
one. Thank you.
I can't believe that you have not been thinking about this.
No, there is a precedent that has been set and has been studied extensively in this village. Our village master plan was a fantastic document that was accepted by the Board of Trustees as basically one of the blueprints to how we can continue to develop around and throughout the village in a way that does not compromise its existing character. And as such, I fully support what the development recommendations are in that particular plan. They do have two options for multifamily housing development areas that could happen. In one particular instance, one of the options is to keep it as open space or to rezone it as R30 zone from an R20 zone. So, the answer is that I'm not opposed to development as long as it's in the right framework. When it comes to rezoning, we have to be very careful to consider that. I think that many of our zoning laws do have a lot of opportunities for development within that construct already. So before we start to change the books, I think we need to take a look at what we have to work with and develop within those confines rather than
So if I hear you
reinventing the
correctly,
wheel.
you need to be really convinced that there aren't any other options before you consider rezoning.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Okay. Andres, how do you feel about it?
Well, I was happy to vote with my fellow trustees of both parties twice against Hampshire's applications for rezoning. The simple fact is Hampshire does have a right to build on a significant portion of its property, that portion that is zoned as residential. I believe any plan for development there should start with our regular planning board process. As part of that process, Hampshire can say, we would like to build however many homes, single family, cluster, whatever it is. As part of the environmental review, they have to submit alternatives. One of those alternatives can be a potential rezoning that would allow condos to be built. Probably not in the same density as they've asked. So then that would go through the planning board process. The planning board would consider all of the alternatives. And if it comes to pass that the best alternative for the village, for the community, after they get all the input, do all the environmental analysis, is a rezoning, then I think the village should consider, the Board of Trustees should consider it. It's too early at this point to say whether we should pass it or not before any sort of review has been done. But the bottom line is they need to go through a regular planning board
So
process.
you feel you don't have enough information yet to know?
Absolutely, we don't have enough information.
Okay. Dave, I know that you have not been privy to all of the information that the sitting trustees have.
But I'll tell you, my ears have been burning with input. And in principle, the village needs some upgraded housing. There's absolutely nothing wrong with multiple family dwellings of various sorts, well-placed and well-zoned. We need more affordable housing, no question about that. My own experience with the planning board is that if you bring them a reasonable proposal, in my case it was not for rezoning, it was for variances, but they are reasonable. But you have to bring them a reasonable proposal that fits within their guidelines. And while there's flexibility,
But the real question here is, I mean, this is a very big issue in the village about considering a rezoning for a property that is within the marine zone, which is protected by the LWRP, the Local Waterfront Revitalization Plan. It's a very big decision and it's painful. I appreciate how hard it has to be. So I guess the question is, would you consider that, or do you feel that that is inviolable and that zoning should never be addressed?
No, it has to be. That's what I'm saying. We have to consider reasonable proposals.
Okay.
Proposals that fit as close as possible to our zoning or the intent of our zoning. Obviously, it can't.
So you wouldn't close the door?
Oh, by no means.
Okay, thank you. Leon, you get the last word on this one.
I think the issue is the process, and the process that's appropriate is for the applicant to go to the planning board and present an application for what's as of right, and then the planning board will undoubtedly ask the applicant to look at alternatives, including cluster housing, as well as condominiums that maintain the current golf course. The planning board will have an open process. It will have its consultants. It will be able to consider alternatives and really have a conversation, a dialogue with the applicant to decide what's possible under as of right and what else might be possible that's consistent with what they have a right of to begin with. And then the planning board will come with a recommendation for what it will approve for site, be it cluster housing or R20 that's as of right, and perhaps with an alternative that it might say is preferable. At that point, it would come to the board to decide. Part of the process will also involve the Harbor and Coastal Zone Management Commission that will look at the flooding issues and water quality and land use issues that fall within its purview. And they too, that committee also of volunteers, of trained volunteers, of expert volunteers, will offer its views of what's possible within the LWRP. And out of that, the board can then decide whether or not to consider zoning based on the recommendations it receives from its committees, and primarily the planning board.
So what I'm hearing is that it's too early to consider rezoning. We haven't looked at the whole picture yet, and we need more information. Okay, I know this is an issue that is a very great concern in this village. Okay, Andres, you're next. The role of the Harbor and Coastal Zone Management Commission, should this board's decisions be advisory, as many boards' decisions are? Commissions are usually not advisory. Or should the HCZM, Harbor and Coastal Zone Management Commission's decisions carry the weight of a commission and be binding? And I guess what I'm getting at here, this is a follow-up to the question about rezoning. How much weight should we give this particular board?
I'd like to make something clear. It's been in the press lately that the Board of Trustees has made the HCZM advisory for everything. That is a misstatement.
Okay.
The only change that was recently done was that now the HCZM is advisory only with regards to village laws and proposed laws and policies and village projects. So John Smith wants to build condos or whatever, the decision of the HCZM is still binding on him. The Village Board of Trustees wants to pass a law to ban smoking in the park. That is advisory only. We still have to send things to them for their analysis, anything that is a type 1 or an unlisted action under the environmental review law, which is a whole lot of things. They then give a recommendation, still based on the LWRP, the same process as it would be for any applicant, and then we can accept that, that recommendation as it is, or we can override that recommendation. The reason that I went across the aisle, reached across the aisle and voted in favor of that change is because we were specifically told by the state that the way that it was before, where the HCZM effectively had a veto over the Board of Trustees, we were told by the state that that was unconstitutional. I personally also agreed with that decision. I think it's improper for an unelected board to have the power to override the elected officials, the elected representatives of the people when it comes to writing the people's laws, spending the people's money. I also think that to allow a veto would also create the possibility of politicizing the board, because future mayors, future boards of trustees may appoint people to the HCZM not based on their skills on environmental issues, but based solely on their willingness to support board actions.
But if I understand you, so it means that the HCZM still has some powers that are not advisory.
Right, over non-village applicants. So if the application is anybody other than the village of Mamaroneck, then their decision is binding. If the application is the village of Mamaroneck, then it is a recommendation.
And okay, I think that's really clear. Thank you very much. Dave, what do you think?
I come to this discussion with somewhat of a bias. I'm an environmentalist. I have solar panels. I'm a life member of the Sierra Club, and I could go on. So my bias here is that anything that takes away from the authority of the HCZM concerns me. And anything that politicizes it by shifting it, even where it may segue into what's considered regulation, to a political environment such as the Board of Trustees can be, bothers me. There are complex legal issues. There are the authority of the HCZM that comes through the LWRP to be seriously considered. So I'm still of the open mind and haven't settled on a hard, fast decision. But my bias is to not jeopardize the authority and expertise of the HCZM.
Okay, thank you. Leon?
The HCZM is a volunteer board made up of 7 members who are appointed over 3 years, and they're eligible to serve 2 terms of office. While they serve, they get training to become expert on making the decisions that they make in terms of consistency, namely whether an application and a permit is consistent with the policies of the LWRP, the Local Waterfront Revitalization Program. We learned that after 30 years of having the HCZM make determinations that are enforceable, that in fact it's inconsistent with state law. The question that was whether that applies only to determinations on village law, namely changes in the village code, or does it also apply to spending decisions and other decisions? It was not clear from the communication we received whether it was. I think the problem with it being advisory to the Board of Trustees is the Board of Trustees has little experience with the LWRP. It has little experience with consistency. It takes time and effort and training to become expert at it, and the board has too many other things to do. And also, I think we need checks and balances in our system, and better the checks and balances, the check come from a volunteer committee that's appointed over time, as opposed to a board that in an instant can turn over and make its decisions. It's too easy for the board to cavalierly treat the recommendations of the HCZM. My view is we should have a referendum which would be whether or not HCZM would be advisory to the board or whether it would be restored to being determinative, and let the voters decide which way makes more sense in terms of enforcement of the LWRP. A trained, experienced board, namely the HCZM, or the Board of Trustees. We're now looking at a law, for example, that was deemed to be inconsistent by the HCZM, and the 5-member board with only 3 of us getting any training, the training consisting of less than 2 hours making decisions about whether it's consistent, and members of the board at our last meeting saying, oh, we don't need to follow that. We don't agree with that without any basis.
How long do people normally serve on the HCZM? Does anybody know?
It's 3-year term.
It's a 3-year term?
But they can be appointed for a second term.
2 terms, so 6 years, and most people probably serve
Most
that?
people serve
I
2
see,
terms.
so you gain a certain amount of expertise in that.
And you engage in training, and you engage in dialogue with other members, with former members, and that's their focus. We at the Board of Trustees have lots of issues to address, and consistency is but one. And to the extent we can delegate that responsibility to an expert volunteer board, one that does not simply turn over every election or 2, we're better off.
Interesting. Okay, Alyssa, thank you.
Well, I want to thank Leon for putting it so succinctly, because I think he took every single point that I too wanted to make. But let me, put it to you straightforward. I admit that I'm not an expert. I mean, I own a business, and I have 18 people that work for me across the U.S., and I have companies, global companies, public companies that trust me. They trust that the decisions that I make are going to give them the best advice. Whether I delegate that to people that work for me, hire other people who have certain types of expertise, they are trusting me. And I hope that the village here of Mamaroneck trusts me to do the same for them. And as such, the HCZM is a board that we delegate to make sure that those who apply for certain permits and uses of property adhere to the LWRP. They're very vital for that. And so from my perspective, A, they are experts. B, I have no problem, delegating to them and making sure that they are enforcing what we have there. God knows the village is not as good as enforcing as others are. And then most importantly, if there is such an issue in this village about who has what control over what, I can't sit here and tell you that what I say is absolute gold, because everybody's got opinions. Their opinions will be noted on primary day. Their opinions will be noted on election day. And why shouldn't their opinions be noted in a referendum that asks what they want of their HCZ and what they want of these volunteer committees that we so thoughtfully put together? So from my standpoint, they're experts. Let the people decide. And I'm also very weary, as Leon, addressed, that the loopholes that now we have created for the village can have dire consequences. For instance, by making the HCZM advisory to the board on a variety of different issues, no matter what they are, if we disagree with them, it says that we should have a document that we now need to do our research and advise why we disagree and why we've gone to make our decision in one regard. Well, it's come to our attention recently, as these decisions are now starting to play out, that we don't necessarily need to have a written out opinion. We could just say, well, we disagree because we disagree. And I disagree with that. If we are going to disagree and be mature enough to understand how and why we are making decisions in the same way that we're asking this board to advise us as such, well, then we need to also do our homework and our research and put a thoughtful piece of material together that explains exactly why we disagree with them and why our stance agrees and adheres to the LWRP versus theirs. So thank you for
This is a very
that.
complicated issue. I think
Absolutely.
that we probably could devote an entire program to talking about advisory boards and commissions, and maybe it requires a complete look back at the way all boards and commissions function in the village. Let's move on. There's so many other things to talk about. Thank you for your very thoughtful responses on that. The Board of Trustees is in a tough spot as it considers the sale or use, repurposing of the firehouse on Mamaroneck Avenue. In full disclosure, to create a consolidated home for our own public access station, LMC-TV. In fact, the Board of Trustees at the time did promise taxpayers that the building, the firehouse, would go on the tax rolls, and that was as consolation for the cost of building a beautiful new firehouse on Palmer Avenue. And that was some years ago. How do you think the village should proceed regarding the possible change in its ownership or use of the old firehouse and the likely probability that it will not become a full freight taxpayer under any situation? And Dave, you get the first shot at this one.
My concern is, as a homeowner and taxpayer, that anytime there's an opportunity to put something on the tax rolls, that's a good thing. The inherent obligation that seemed to have been taken on when building the new firehouse to put it on the tax rolls rings true to me. Same token, I have a certain amount of affection and loyalty for LMC-TV and would love to see this building that I believe is either for sale or lease, according to the sign out front, moved into a really professional facility. That's a valuable piece of property. It's in a prime location. There should be some very imaginative, creative, and possibly mixed use for the building that both maximize its role as a taxpayer, but also gives an opportunity for the village to use it well and creatively. And I don't think those kinds of proposals have been studied full-blown so that we can really consider them seriously and what the trade-offs are.
Okay, thank you. Very thoughtful. Leon, what do you think?
I think LMC-TV plays a very important role in this community. It has a very close relationship with the village government. It is helps us perform our functions better. We do have a firehouse that's been empty for years. We promised the taxpayers we would sell it to reduce the debt. And when the proposal first came to us in January of 2013, I suggested, why don't we get an appraisal and see what it's worth and whether or not what's being proposed to us is within reason relative to the market. At our last work session this past Monday, in fact, that's what our attorney said we are about to do. I hope we can come to an arrangement, come to an agreement whereby LMC-TV can move from its current quarters, which are, spread out and relatively inefficient, to something that will be really a jewel for the village. And if that requires that each of the communities pay some more in terms of rent in order to make that happen, we all benefit from it. And so, and whether, quite frankly, whether or not LMC-TV ends up being located at the firehouse, or perhaps even, if we have creative ownership of the playhouse, perhaps the ground floor of that building can be turned into studios for LMC-TV. The point is, it's not whether it's a firehouse, it's getting LMC-TV centrally located.
Right, LMC has its issues about consolidating all of its
Right.
offices and
So
studios.
I understand the economics of consolidating, but also we have to be mindful of our taxpayers. We can't simply gift to LMC-TV or any other organization.
Thank you. Lisa, what do you think?
Well, there are various different ways that you can give back to a community and that you can invest in your community, both that benefit the pockets and benefit people intellectually. But I'm going to take a little bit step back because it brings up a secondary issue, which we're probably not addressing, which is the board that promised this village that the firehouse would be sold and then, go back into our tax roll is no longer the board that operates our village today, which is an inherent problem. When you have, when you have incumbents that are running, there's a learning curve and there's a process that we have to go through in order to get up to speed on these various issues. And so what we say here, if we remain in office, yes, then there's teeth to it and we could bring that forth. But what we say here and we don't remain in office, it doesn't matter because whoever comes in next will have what they say. But to answer your question more directly, I absolutely support it. I think that it's a fabulous location. I think that the village can sustain itself absolutely just fine without that tax benefit. And in return, I think by giving back to the community in a centralized location, we can find other ways that will benefit our tax roll. I know that there are various creative ways to have a community that has a television studio, a local television studio on its main street on 6th Avenue, will attract a lot more people into LMC-TV, attract different types of programming, hopefully up that programming, and also be attractive to others who are looking to come into this community. There are people that love TV and want to get into it. And if they have access to a way to do that, that's right in their backyard and right in their community, well, what better way to do that?
Okay. Thank you. Andres, what do you think?
I completely agree with Alyssa. I support LMC-TV moving to the firehouse. Right now, the firehouse is riddled with asbestos. It has no elevator. It is not handicap accessible in any way. Has a giant, really all it's good for right now is storage space. I think it is important to make sure that we have all the information we need as far as, maybe the thing is worth way more than we think it is. Personally, I doubt that, but I await the results from the assessor. But I believe we should focus less on an individual building being on the tax roll and think more about development generally in the village. I think in the business areas on Mamaroneck Avenue, on both sides of the track, we need tracks, and in the industrial area, we need to encourage commercial building. Commercial buildings pay a higher share of property taxes than residences do. So if we have more commercial building, that lowers the pie that all the residents have to pay. So if we have more commercial and the budget stays the same, which is likely to happen with commercial because commercial, having a store doesn't...
Just the structure is different.
Exactly.
So as far as the firehouse goes, Do you think that
I
it should be repurposed into a home for LMC, or should it be sold?
I think it should, and that will encourage further commercial development of more lucrative things.
Okay.
Restaurants maybe wouldn't pay necessarily as much as, say, some kind of tech startup that may be encouraged to move to Mamaroneck and be on the avenue because of the cultural institutions nearby.
Okay. You know, you've led me right into my next question. And Alyssa, you're going to get this one. While we talk about the sale and change to a venerable village structure, let's talk about our movie theater, about to be demolished, as I understand, and replaced by condos. And there are other cherished village structures. Everyone has concern about the Fenimore Cooper Delancey House and what its future will be. It would be easy to proclaim our devotion to these structures, but can you outline a strategy for preserving them?
That's a really challenging question. Well, what the Playhouse, what the Fenimore Cooper House does is it keeps us rooted in the history here in our village. It's really important. The plans for the Playhouse, as I understand it, is that the majority of it would get demolished with the exception of the face, which would keep the characteristic on the avenue, which is quite lovely. But there are, I don't think that our village does enough, and it's not necessarily up to the trustees, but we can find creative ways to do this. But we used to have a very strong historical group that would take a look at all the different buildings and make recommendations and then bring those forth to the village trustees to mark them as certain properties. It would be great to reform that committee and to make sure that we are keeping sites on these historical or prominent locations throughout the village and that we can mind those in our backyard. It doesn't need to be a national landmark. It could be a local landmark, but we need to take the steps in order to recognize them as such. I also made the recommendation to implement what is now the Business Overlay District. In the Business Overlay District, the intent was to ensure a smooth and consistent building facade up and down the avenue so that you have, that there wouldn't be any infill issues that might come in, there wouldn't be any gaping holes between buildings, and that we as a village would have the ability to say, from a development standpoint, how we want the look of the avenue to feel and to be represented as those who are coming and leaving our town. That's our main thoroughfare. It was adopted. It was not adopted to the full intent that I had initially proposed it, which was a bit disappointing, which is why I personally didn't vote for it, because I felt that the adoption of it stripped the teeth of it, and it was put into place as a, for lack of a better term, a facade. To accommodate those who think that it's doing what it's doing, but it has nothing to it that's going to be any bearing.
You would be revisiting this.
I would like to revisit this with a majority of the board who understands what we need to do to tighten up that law, to protect what we have, the viability of our downtown district, and how we want that to look and feel. And we don't really have that yet defined. And I think it's really important as a board for us to get together, everybody on the board, to understand what is the feel that you want Mamaroneck to elicit for those who come into town. Do you want them to feel hungry because there's so many restaurants?
Well,
do you want them to feel?
Yes, we have lots. But in preserving the historical structure, the character structures, it's going to require some teeth, I would guess, because I think everybody was kind of surprised to hear that the movie theater was not going to be preserved as a theater. Andres, do you want to address this?
Yeah, I was quite proud to reach across party lines and vote in favor of the law that Alyssa was referring to. The law basically says that in the Central Business District, and what we call the Avenue, on this side of the tracks, before you are given, you can be given a permit to demolish a building, you need to have the approvals for what comes next. Sometimes our land use process takes a while. So what would happen is, in the case of the Playhouse, they have every incentive to knock it down as soon as possible because you pay a lot less taxes on an empty hole than you do on a full building. We don't want giant empty holes on Mamaroneck Avenue. It doesn't work for the neighboring businesses, and it also just looks bad, and it's a safety issue, so on and so forth. The law also strengthened the normal architectural requirements that we have in this village. Generally, you can't be too alike, you can't be too dissimilar. Strengthened those on that section of the avenue as well, the overlay. I think we have to be very careful when it comes to rules such as that, because first, we don't want to discourage new properties coming in. We don't want to discourage building in our central business district. At the same time, I don't want Mamaroneck to look like some of the cookie cutter towns that you see. There's certain municipalities where that dictate signage all has to be the same color, your facade has to be the same color. I like the attitude on
nature.
Mamaroneck Avenue that not every building looks the same. You have some that look like old style houses, some that look like row
right.
houses.
But as far as preserving the architectural delightfulness of some of our buildings, I mean, that's really the question. How do we preserve those that are clearly of historical significance?
I would welcome a review of that.
Okay.
To see how we can further
Okay, so you
protect
attach
the
value
avenue.
to that.
I do.
Okay, good. Dave, what do you think?
There are a number of components of this. There's the theater. I think the theater is gone.
Right.
I think that's old news. Crying over it won't do us any good in dealing with how we go forward. The facade doesn't seem to be too much of an issue, that it would work to maintain the facade. All you have to do is go down to some of the areas in New York City where old buildings, the facade is still there, and then there's a steel and glass high-rise right up behind it, and it's used. The old building is used as a lobby.
Well, but that clearly wouldn't work with something like the Fenimore Cooper House, would it?
No, I'm referring, of course, to
Yeah,
the
the
theater.
playhouse.
So there's a lot of creative things that can be done that enhance the mixed use and the quality mixed use aspect of the avenue. Yeah, going over to the Fenimore Cooper House, I mean, that is a very, very difficult issue. You know, it's not well located.
Yeah, there are lots of problems with it, and yet people feel devoted to it.
And rightfully so.
Yeah.
I don't know if the old schoolhouse has any kind of precedent there for what can be done with the property, but of course we have.
You're talking about the schoolhouse that was moved and put into the park.
Yeah, across the street.
Okay, and a creative solution
Yep.
to the possible destruction.
I would think that accepting that it's really, for all intents and purposes, not a viable location for it to be preserved as some kind of historical building, that there's got to be more creativity in looking at what the alternatives are and how we can do something well with it, that we can still put the label on it that we value and still get an economic and viable use out of it.
Okay, great. Leon, you get the last word on this one.
Let me add, the Playhouse will, from all we understand, the current owners will retain the facade, so it will retain the historical look that it has. It will not have anything behind that facade. In terms of the Delancey House, it is a private property on private land, and the owners have offered to give it away if we simply move it and find a place for it. The problem is our taxpayers, our residents value historical, our history, historical buildings, but I don't think that our residents are prepared to pay higher taxes to retain that property where it is. Now, coming back to the Playhouse, there are two questions. The key question has been, can we retain it as a theater? And the current owners who bought it and have movie houses around the Northeast do not want to run a movie theater there. Perhaps with new owners, we can find some way to retain some performance space in the building, but I think it will take new owners. And I've talked to the village planner about how we can incentivize any such new owner to go along with performance space, be it movies, be it something for Emlyn at that. In terms of the law, let me just talk about that briefly. First, if the law makes sense in terms of requiring that a demolition permit not be issued until a building permit is in place.
In other words, someone has to have a clear plan of what's
Right.
going to start happening.
Right. But the problem is we shouldn't get carried away with that, because that's no guarantee that the building plan will actually get implemented. We have corner of Delancey and Boston Post Road, there was a building plan that was approved but never got built. Secondly, if the owner decides to demolish the building before they build, it doesn't affect property value, because the property value is what it is based on its potential for whatever it's allowed to be.
Redevelopment, right.
So I think it's a flawed argument that we somehow saved ourselves. Secondly, I voted against the law, not because I oppose requirement for a building permit before a demolition permit be issued, but part of the law requires that the planning board consider and require the building to be visually compatible with the buildings and environment with which it is related. It just so happens that we have a Board of Architectural Review, which looks at buildings and makes sure that we don't create excessive uniformity nor excessive incongruity, which is another way of saying visually compatible. So I objected to simply passing the law before passing the proposed law to the Board of Architectural Review and the Planning Board to figure out whether or not it makes sense for this additional review to be conducted by one board, not by two. So board members talk about eliminating duplication, but here was a clear case of duplication. Here was a case where we should have gone to our volunteer boards and asked for their advice, but we didn't. Instead people reached across the aisle to make a rash approval of the law when further consideration would have made more sense.
Yes, I understand, and yet the frustration is that people are desperate to try to preserve
We
some
want to
things
preserve
that-
it, let's do it
and-
intelligently.
Right. It's a very complicated issue. We probably have time for everybody to address one more question, and yet I've got so many more. So we're going to try to move really rapidly. Andre, I'm going to ask you first. Let's talk about sport time in Harbor Island Park. What do you see as the future for sport time? I mean, is it consistent with the comprehensive plan for Harbor Island Park, and where do you see the future?
Well, first off, sport time, almost certainly, they are not moving from their location. They're not moving to behind the sewage plant.
That's not going to happen.
That's not
a
going to
daycare.
happen because we thought maybe the village could borrow the money at the low interest rate that the village pays, and then sports time would pay us back. We were told by our lawyers who specialize in bonds that that is not possible. So sport time is not going to invest the $7 million or whatever it is to move. We are looking into possibilities of expansion or how it's going to be at its current location.
Are they going to try to build a multi-use facility, multi-sport complex?
That is under negotiation.
Okay.
The other issue is that where it currently is not flood safe. We would need to elevate sport time potentially. Part of the issue that's been brought to our attention is that the Board of Trustees in 1980 or so accepted a grant for some $80,000 from the federal government, I believe it was the federal government, for park improvements. That grant may have had a string that prevents us from building any further permanent structures on Harbor Island that may or may not include a potential lifting up of sport time. Unfortunately, that happens sometimes when boards bind the hands of future boards. It's something that I think should be avoided, and it's something that I look to avoid as a trustee.
Okay, thank you. What do you think about sport time, Dave?
I think tennis at Harbor Island is an appropriate sport to have there. We have other sports, we should have tennis. And my understanding is that it's an economic approach to tennis to have sport time supply that sport facility. So now what we're talking about is, how high is their balloon? They want to have a single balloon. I believe there are FEMA requirements that it's going to be too high, somebody's requirements. They want the new clubhouse. There are height requirements there. As Andre said, there are flood issues and all of that. It all has to be considered in light of probably keeping them viable, but within the spirit of the service they provide the village, and preserving Harbor Island as a community facility.
Okay, so sport time stays, and we've got to see what they can come up with and how the village can
Absolutely.
figure it out. Leon, what do you think? I know we only have a few minutes, so I'm going to have to cut you off.
We have a contract with Sport Time for them to operate the facility. The 1980 grant that we received, we haven't heard back from our lawyers what the impact is of that. When we first entered office and we considered whether or not we could help to finance the move of the Sport Time facility from its current location to behind the sewage treatment plant, we were told we can't. And so we said, let's negotiate and come to a final agreement about its current location so that we can then move on and look at the Harbor Island Master Improvement Plan that was developed almost 10 years ago, which had a long-term vision for that, for the park. So I'm encouraging our village manager, our lawyers, to move as quickly as possible. Things move very slowly, and we can't move it fast. We're trying to move it along, but at the same time, the board is making decisions that really undermine Harbor Island in terms of the master plan that was developed 10 years ago. This board approved with the mayor, the deputy mayor, and trustee Bermudez Holstrom repairing the parks garage at Harbor Island, spending hundreds of thousands to repair it without even looking at moving it to the industrial area. So we take prime real estate on the waterfront and use it for a garage. That's just wrong. Now, at the minimum, we should look at what the alternatives are. The board, with the same majority, voted to spend almost $70,000 on a higher fence at the beach and moving the current fence along the road leading up to the pavilion. It's a restricted access road, without looking at alternatives. The argument for the higher fence at the beach was we have kids sneaking over the fence. Well, we have a new superintendent of recreation. She implemented a new plan where people get wristbands. So there's no longer a problem. The board the majority on that vote was simply unwilling to look at alternatives to deal with that problem. There was a safety issue along the road.
Yes.
Again, that same majority refused to look at other ways to make it safer. Speed bumps, an electronic gate, whatever. It simply rushed along to solve a problem that probably can be solved better and less expensively and more consistently with a long-term plan for Harbor Island.
Okay. Thank you, Lissa. I want you to have the time to get in the last word on this. We're almost out of time.
Very similar sentiment. There are so many different options to everything that we have, and it's frustrating to be on a board that just wants to make decisions and they're not thinking of the consequences or not looking at how different pieces of the puzzle could work together. Yes. And tennis is it's great for our village. It's great to have it here. 20% of our village residents are members of the tennis. So yeah, we're bringing in people from outside, and yes, we're making money from that, but is the middle of Harbor Island Park the best location for it? Now, we formed an industrial area committee to look at development opportunities within the industrial area. What type of things? And they keep talking about sport facilities and this type of facility. And I think about other communities where they build these big tennis facilities, and they're near train stations. They're near these quote unquote.
Oh, so you're
dead
thinking
zones.
that this might be relocated away from the park?
I think that as options, that I think we ought to be good business people together and in conjunction with Sport Time. They complain about how there are other facilities, even that they own and operate, that are so much more modernized and so much more beautiful that they're losing business from Mamaroneck because people are going there. But yet they are still stuck where they are because they're not thinking outside the box. So again, if we want to talk about putting hands across the aisle, this is a great opportunity where private and public sectors can put their hands across the aisle and find a great solution to work with one another that helps the entire village and the vision for the entire village.
So I hear you. This needs work. This requires a lot
Absolutely.
more time. I wish we had more time because there's so many other topics I'd like to cover. But I thank you all for your thoughtful responses and the time and energy that you're willing to put forward for the Village of Mamaroneck. Voters on September 9 have a very fine and very difficult choice. I wish you all the best of luck. I'm Alice Bloom. Thank you.